The Confluence maintained a database of approximately 47,000 catalogued worlds, each rated on a scale of hospitality that ranged from pleasant resort destination to instant liquefaction upon atmospheric entry. Class-VII Death Worlds occupied the extreme end of this spectrum, planets so comprehensively hostile that even military strategists, who traditionally viewed terrible places as potential training grounds, marked them with the galactic equivalent of absolutely not worth it. These worlds weren't just dangerous in the exciting, adventurous sense. They were dangerous in the tedious, everything wants to kill you, including the air sense. Most species treated them as navigational hazards to route around, cosmic warning signs that something had gone terribly wrong during planetary formation. Verdis 9 held the distinction of being classified as a Class 7 for three separate reasons: atmospheric toxicity in certain seasons, an ecosystem that operated on principles of aggressive competition rather than anything resembling balance, and weather patterns that seemed personally offended by the concept of predictability. It sat in a relatively trafficked sector, which meant freight routes occasionally passed within a few light hours of its orbit, but no one with functional survival instincts actually went there. The planet had been surveyed exactly once 40 years prior by a remote probe that lasted 17 minutes before something ate it. Kael Mendren had never planned to visit Verdis 9. He'd never planned to visit any Death World, frankly, because his job as a cargo surveyor for the Tethys Freight Collective involved sitting in climate-controlled vessels, checking manifests, and occasionally arguing with shipping AI about container optimization. It was boring work, which meant it was safe work, which meant Kael had spent 8 years doing it without incident. He was competent in the way that reliable people are competent, thoroughly unremarkable, until something broke, at which point his particular brand of methodical problem-solving became temporarily valuable. The something that broke was a coolant regulator in the ship's primary drive system. The ship's AI, which possessed the calm demeanor of someone describing a mildly inconvenient weather pattern, announced this failure with clinical precision. Cascade failure in progress. Hull breach imminent in sectors 4 through 9. Recommend immediate evacuation. Kael, who had run evac drills exactly as often as regulations required and not once more, moved through the procedures with the same energy most people reserved for leaving work slightly early on a Friday. He reached the escape pod, strapped in, confirmed the beacon was active, and ejected precisely 47 seconds before the main ship converted itself into expensive debris. The pod's systems calculated trajectories, determined that Verdis 9 was the only gravitational body within range, and made an executive decision about his immediate future. Kael watched this happen on the navigation display with a sense of mild annoyance. The way someone might react to discovering their commute now included an unexpected detour through a structural fire. The descent through Verdis 9's atmosphere was loud, hot, and thoroughly unpleasant. The pod's heat shielding performed exactly as designed, which meant Kael survived, but every surface inside the pod became uncomfortably warm to the touch. He could see the jungle below through the viewport, an unbroken expanse of green that looked less like vegetation and more like some kind of biological carpet bomb had gone off and never stopped exploding. The canopy was thick enough that he couldn't see the ground until the pod crashed through it, breaking branches that seemed to resist with personal malice. The landing was hard but survivable. The pod's integrity held. Kael sat in the sudden quiet, running through his mental checklist: functional limbs, no major bleeding, beacon broadcasting, supplies accessible. He had approximately 4 months of food if rationed carefully, basic survival gear, a multi-tool that could handle most repair work, and a distress beacon that would reach someone eventually. The pod's computer estimated rescue response time at 4 to 6 months, assuming anyone picked up the signal, and decided a single human was worth the detour. Kael unsealed the pod hatch, and immediately regretted it. The jungle wasn't just hot and humid, it was aggressively hot and humid, the kind of environment that made breathing feel like work. The air smelled like decomposition and growing things and something else he couldn't identify but suspected might be toxic. Sound hit him next, buzzing, clicking, rustling, calling, the constant noise of an ecosystem that apparently never slept. Everything he could see was either growing on something else or trying to eat something else, sometimes both simultaneously. He stood there for exactly 30 seconds, processing. Then he began his inventory. The escape pod had landed in a small clearing, small being relative, since the opening was barely 3 times the pod's diameter and surrounded by vegetation that looked like it was actively planning to reclaim the space. Kael stepped onto soil that felt disturbingly wet and immediately sank 2 inches. The ground was less solid surface and more organic matter in various stages of decay. He pulled his boot free with a squelching sound and made a mental note: unstable ground, probable drainage issues, unsuitable for extended habitation without platform construction. A rational species would panic at this point. Most Confluence members possessed well-developed threat response systems that triggered appropriate distress behaviors when faced with overwhelming danger. The cache would enter a meditation state to conserve resources. The Verini would immediately begin broadcasting distress calls on all frequencies. The Talmorians would perform last rites and prepare for honorable death. Kael pulled out his datapad and started a spreadsheet titled Immediate Concerns, subdivided into categories: water, shelter, food, medical, and a catch-all section he labeled Everything Trying to Kill Me. He was 3 entries into the last category when something with too many legs skittered across his boot. He noted it under arthropods, unclear toxicity level, and continued documenting. 300 kilometers above, in an orbital position carefully chosen to avoid detection, 2 researchers observed this behavior with growing confusion. Kilik and Morvanth belonged to the Vresh, a species that had turned the study of hostile environments into something approaching an art form. They didn't survive on death worlds, nobody was that stupid, but they maintained monitoring stations, around several dozen of them, collecting data on ecosystem dynamics and occasionally watching other species make fatal errors in judgment. The arrival of Kael's escape pod had triggered their automated alert systems. A human, alone, on Verdis 9. Kilik had immediately begun recording, anticipating documentation of another species' predictable failure. The Vresh had catalogued thousands of such incidents across multiple worlds. The pattern was always the same: initial shock, desperate activity, declining competence, eventual system failure. Survival time varied by species and individual capability, but the outcome remained consistent. Vital signs stable, Morvanth reported, monitoring the biometric data their sensors could extract from standard emergency suit telemetry. Elevated heart rate, but within expected parameters for stress response. No signs of injury from the landing. "How long do you estimate?" Kilik asked, adjusting the visual feed to track Kael's movements around the pod. 72 hours if he remains cautious. Perhaps 5 days if he's competent with the survival kit. Humans have decent adaptability ratings, but Verdis 9 exceeds most species' tolerance thresholds. Morvanth paused, watching Kael crouch to examine something on the ground. What is he doing? Unclear. He appears to be documenting. Kilik enhanced the image, trying to read the datapad screen. Is that a spreadsheet? They watched in silence as Kael spent the next 20 minutes methodically cataloging everything within visual range of the pod, occasionally pausing to take samples of soil, leaves, and one unfortunate insect that made the mistake of landing on his arm. He sealed each sample in separate containers from the survival kit, labeled them with precise notation, and continued his survey. "This is not standard survival behavior," Morvanth said finally. "Perhaps he's injured. Neural damage affecting judgment. Biometrics show normal cognitive function. He's just organized." Kael finished his initial survey as the local sun began dropping toward the horizon. He had identified 17 distinct plant species within immediate range, noted 3 different categories of animal sounds, and determined that the water content in the air was high enough that collection systems would be viable. He also concluded that remaining outside after dark would be stupid, retreated into the escape pod, sealed the hatch, and began reviewing his notes. Above, the Verdis researchers updated their estimates. Perhaps a week, they decided. Humans were known for being surprisingly stubborn about dying. By the 3rd day, Kael had established what he considered the bare minimum for functional survival: a water collection system using the pod's condensation recycler and several improvised funnels made from heat-formed debris panels. A reinforced perimeter around the pod using fallen branches, not to stop anything serious, but to create a tripwire system that would at least make noise, and a comprehensive list of everything that had tried to bite, sting, or dissolve him in the past 72 hours. The jungle provided nothing freely. Every resource came with attached complications. Water collected from the canopy contained 3 separate compounds that the survival kit's analyzer flagged as potentially toxic. The filtration system could handle 2 of them. The 3rd required boiling, which meant fuel consumption, which meant rationing. Edible plants existed in theory. The Confluence database listed Verdis 9 as having carbon-based vegetation compatible with most species' digestive systems. But in practice, everything Kael tested either triggered the analyzer's poison warnings or tasted like concentrated hostility. He'd lost 2 kilos already, and his caloric calculations were becoming uncomfortable. But Kael had something most species lacked when facing hostile environments: the capacity to simply sit still and watch without treating inactivity as wasted time. Humans had spent significant portions of their evolutionary history as persistence hunters, which required the ability to observe, track, and wait with the patience of someone who understood that rushing got you killed while patience just got you tired. So he watched. He watched the small reptilian creatures that moved through the undergrowth in the early morning, noting their feeding patterns and preferred routes. He watched the insects that swarmed certain plants while avoiding others, marking correlations between species and vegetation types. He watched birds, or bird analogues, 6-winged things with too many eyes, that circled specific areas of the canopy at precise times, suggesting behavioral patterns tied to food availability or territorial instinct. The Verdis researchers were baffled. Their models had predicted tool fabrication by day 4, aggressive resource harvesting by day 6, and a probable critical mistake by day 8. Instead, Kael spent hours sitting on the pod's roof, documenting animal behavior in his datapad with the dedication of someone conducting a university research project rather than fighting for survival. "Is he aware he's dying?" Killick asked, watching Kael spend his 4th consecutive hour observing a particular vine that attracted numerous insect species. "Biometrics indicate he's aware of his declining caloric intake," Morvanth replied. "He's reduced physical activity to compensate, but his stress markers are actually decreasing." "That makes no sense." Agreed. What the Verdis couldn't understand, what most species couldn't understand, was that Kael wasn't being passive. He was collecting data. Every hour of observation reduced his uncertainty about the environment, and uncertainty was more dangerous than hunger. He needed to know what was safe before he risked eating it. He needed to understand movement patterns before he traveled beyond the pod. He needed to identify threats before they identified him. On day 6, his patience paid off. He'd been watching a small mammal analog, something with dense fur and clever paws, navigate through an area dense with a particular plant species he'd tentatively designated purple thorn due to its distinctive coloring and the spines covering its stems. The purple thorn sap had tested as highly toxic, even skin contact caused irritation. Yet the mammal moved through it without issue, occasionally biting into the stems and extracting some kind of pulp. Kael followed the creature's route and discovered it always paused at another plant, something low-growing with broad leaves, and rubbed against it before and after purple thorn exposure. He collected samples of both plants, ran what tests his limited equipment allowed, and discovered that the broad-leafed plant's oils neutralized the purple thorn toxin. The mammal had been essentially applying preventative medicine before handling dangerous food sources. That night, Kael successfully consumed his first local food, a tuber from a plant he'd been avoiding because it grew too close to purple thorn clusters. With the broadleaf oil as protection, he could harvest them safely. The tubers tasted like extremely bitter potatoes mixed with dirt, but they registered as non-toxic and contained adequate calories. He ate one, waited 12 hours to confirm no adverse effects, then added them to his viable food list. The Verdis updated their survival estimate to 3 weeks. Morvanth noted in the research log that the human had essentially plagiarized another species' survival strategy. Killick found this observation vaguely disturbing, but couldn't articulate why. By the end of the first week, Kael had established a routine dawn water collection, while humidity was highest. Morning observation sessions, focusing on new areas of jungle, afternoon shelter improvements, evening equipment maintenance and note review. The chaos hadn't decreased. The jungle was still trying to kill him with casual consistency. But patterns were emerging from the noise, and patterns meant predictability, and predictability meant he could plan. The Verdis researchers, watching a human treat a death world like a particularly complicated puzzle, began to suspect their models might be missing something fundamental. 3 weeks after the crash, Kael's camp had evolved in ways that surprised even him. The escape pod remained the core structure, but it was now surrounded by what could only be described as infrastructure. A raised platform built from fallen wood provided sleeping space above the ground level, where most nocturnal predators hunted. A water collection system using woven plant fibers channeled rain and condensation into storage containers. A waste disposal site positioned deliberately downwind attracted scavenger species that, through their feeding patterns, kept other more dangerous scavengers away from the immediate camp area. Everything served multiple purposes because Kael had learned the first rule of survival in resource-scarce environments. Efficiency wasn't optional. The raised platform doubled as tool storage. The water channels provided early warning when certain insects used them as travel routes. The scavenger feeding site functioned as both waste management and perimeter monitoring. When the scavengers scattered, something bigger was approaching. Humans, the Verdis researchers were learning, could not tolerate disorganization even when actively dying. It was apparently a species-wide compulsion. Where other beings might focus purely on immediate survival, humans started implementing systems. Kael couldn't just collect water. He had to build a water collection system. He couldn't just find food. He had to establish sustainable food sources. The distinction seemed trivial until the researchers ran projections comparing resource efficiency between reactive survival and systematic planning. The numbers were uncomfortably clear. Kael's organized approach consumed fewer calories while producing more reliable results than the desperate scrambling their models predicted. He's modifying the local ecosystem, Morvant observed during their morning review session. She highlighted several data points showing changes in animal movement patterns around Kael's camp. Scavenger populations have increased by 14% within a 100-meter radius. Certain plant species are showing accelerated growth in the disturbed soil near his shelter. Modification implies intention. Kilik countered. He's simply surviving. The environmental changes are incidental. Are they? They watched Kael spend his afternoon digging a drainage channel that would redirect water flow away from his platform. The work was slow, methodical, and seemed designed not just to solve his immediate flooding problem, but to create a controlled water flow that would discourage certain plant species while encouraging others. After 2 hours of labor, he'd created what amounted to basic water management infrastructure. That's not survival, Morvant said quietly. That's engineering. The real test came on day 24, when a pack of apex predators investigated the camp. The creatures were magnificent examples of evolutionary hostility. 6-limbed, thermally camouflaged to blend with the jungle temperature gradients, equipped with sensory organs that tracked electromagnetic signatures from nerve activity. They hunted in coordinated groups, and their success rate on Verdis 9 approached 93%. Nothing survived their attention through combat. The creatures were simply too well designed for killing. The Verdis researchers expected this encounter to end Kael's survival run. They watched the pack approach, their movements perfectly synchronized, closing in on the camp from multiple angles. Kael was inside his shelter, apparently unaware, performing routine equipment maintenance. Then the predators hit the perimeter zone and stopped. Not because of any physical barrier, Kael had nothing that could stop them, but because the scent profile was wrong. The area smelled like the small herbivores the predators preferred, but the trails led away from camp rather than toward it. The electromagnetic signature they were tracking was present but diffused, scattered across multiple locations rather than concentrated in one defendable position. The predators spent 17 minutes investigating, found nothing worth the energy expenditure of an actual attack, and departed to hunt easier prey. Kael emerged from his shelter 20 minutes later, checked his perimeter markers to confirm something had triggered them, noted the distinctive track patterns in the soft soil, and returned to his maintenance work. The Verdis researchers sat in stunned silence, reviewing the footage. Kilik finally spoke. He prepared for that. Days ago, he prepared for that specific threat. He observed their hunting patterns, Morvant said, pulling up Kael's notes from earlier weeks. He documented their prey preferences, movement behaviors, sensory limitations. Then he exploited those limitations. Other species fight apex predators or flee from them. Humans apparently trick them into losing interest. Kilik adjusted their survival estimate again. 6 weeks now, possibly 8 if Kael could maintain his current resource efficiency. They filed their report with the Central Verdis Research Collective, noting that human survival strategies appeared to operate on principles of environmental manipulation rather than direct competition or adaptation. The report was flagged as preliminary findings requiring extended observation. The researchers settled in for a longer study than they'd anticipated. By the second month, the relationship between Kael and Verdis 9 had shifted into something neither party had explicitly agreed to, but both seemed to accept. The jungle was still hostile. That was simply its nature, the result of millions of years of competitive evolution that had produced an ecosystem operating on principles of constant aggressive growth. But Kael had stopped treating it as an enemy to defeat and started treating it as a system to navigate. The distinction mattered more than the Verdis researchers had initially understood. Kael wasn't trying to conquer the jungle or force it to accommodate him. He was finding the spaces where his needs, and the ecosystem's existing patterns overlapped, then gently encouraging those overlaps to expand. Take the cultivated area near his platform. Kael had noticed certain plants attracted pollinating insects, and those insects' larvae preyed on the beetle species that kept destroying his shelter's wooden supports. So he'd transplanted several of those plants closer to his camp, providing them with cleared growing space and regular water access. The plants thrived, the pollinators established territories, the beetles declined in number. Kael hadn't eliminated the problem. The beetles were still present, but he'd created a competing pressure that reduced their impact to manageable levels, or the composting system. Organic waste attracted decomposer organisms, which accelerated rot, which produced methane buildups, which attracted predators with sensitive chemical detection. The obvious solution was to move waste far from camp. Kael's solution was to create a controlled decomposition site that fed specific decomposer species, which in turn reduced the smell signature that attracted dangerous scavengers. The predators still came occasionally, but they found environments deliberately designed to be unrewarding, and eventually most of them established hunting patterns that simply bypassed his camp. He'd even managed to create a rudimentary perimeter defense using territorial amphibians. The creatures were semi-aquatic, aggressively protective of their breeding pools, and completely indifferent to humans. Kael had redirected a small water flow to create a shallow pond on one approach to his camp, waited for amphibians to colonize it, which took 3 days, and then benefited from having neighbors who would attack anything that disturbed their territory. He didn't control them. He just created conditions they found attractive, which happened to align with his security needs. The Vresh researchers were now in active debate about what they were witnessing. Keelik maintained this was still survival behavior, just unusually sophisticated. Morvantz had begun pulling historical data on human development, agricultural practices, animal domestication, ecosystem engineering projects that reshaped entire continents. They do this everywhere, she said, displaying image after image of human worlds. Forests managed for specific output, rivers redirected for irrigation, entire landscapes transformed, not through destruction but through patient, systematic modification. This isn't unusual behavior for them. It's standard operating procedure. But he's alone on a death world with minimal equipment. Does that matter? Morvant gestured at their live feed showing Kael calmly harvesting fruit from a plant he'd cultivated from cuttings. He has time, observation skills, and apparently the fundamental inability to leave any system unoptimized. Those seem to be sufficient. Kael's expanding understanding of Verdis 9 had reached the point where he could read the jungle like weather patterns. Certain fungi indicated water table depths. Specific animal calls signaled incoming storms with more accuracy than his survival kit's sensors. Plant growth patterns revealed seasonal changes weeks before they manifested in temperature or precipitation. The jungle was still dangerous, that would never change, but it was no longer random. It operated on rules, and once Kael understood the rules, he could plan accordingly. His food situation had stabilized entirely. He'd identified 7 reliably edible plant species, learned to prepare 2 types of insect larvae that provided excellent protein, and discovered that certain fish analogues in a nearby stream were both catchable and safe to eat if cooked thoroughly. His caloric intake now exceeded his output most days. He'd actually gained back the weight he'd lost in the first week, plus additional muscle mass from the physical labor of camp maintenance. The medical kit, which he'd expected to deplete rapidly, remained largely unused. Turns out that when you spent weeks observing which plants, insects and animals were dangerous before touching them, you avoided most injuries. The few cuts and scrapes he'd sustained had healed normally. Verdis 9's aggressive microbial environment apparently hadn't evolved mechanisms to handle human immune systems, which meant his body's standard defenses worked fine. By day 60, Kael had successfully preserved food for long-term storage, using a technique he'd learned by watching how certain trees protected their seed pods. He dried edible plants using solar heat concentrated through salvaged pod panels, then sealed them with tree resin that contained natural antimicrobial compounds. The result was crude but functional, food that would remain edible for months, which meant he was no longer operating meal to meal, but had actually achieved food security. The Verdis researchers stopped making survival estimates. Kael wasn't surviving anymore. He was impossibly living. 4 months into his unplanned residency on Verdis 9, the Verdis researchers' monitoring logs read less like survival documentation and more like anthropological field notes on habitation patterns. Kael's daily routine had stabilized into something that resembled normal life, assuming one ignored the fact that normal life didn't typically involve quite so many things trying to digest you. Morning began with checking weather indicators, certain plants that responded to humidity changes, and atmospheric pressure shifts more accurately than any instrument in his survival kit. Based on these readings, Kael adjusted his daily plans. High humidity meant good water collection, but also increased activity from moisture-dependent predators. Clear skies meant better solar charging, but required more active hydration management. He'd learned to think 3 days ahead, anticipating resource needs and environmental changes before they became problems. The garden, if it could be called that, required minimal maintenance now. Kael had selected plants that thrived with neglect and arranged them to create mutually supportive growing conditions. Nitrogen-fixing species next to nutrient-demanding species. Ground cover that suppressed aggressive weeds while retaining moisture. The whole system functioned with only occasional intervention, removing invasive species, harvesting mature growth, replanting when necessary. His shelter had expanded from the original platform to include a covered workspace where he could perform tasks during rain, which occurred frequently and with personal malice. Storage systems kept food, tools and materials organized and accessible. A crude but functional early warning system using plant fiber tripwires and suspended metal fragments alerted him to large animal movements near camp. Everything had a place. Everything served a purpose. The most telling change was in Kael's stress markers. The Verdis biometric monitoring showed cortisol levels that had actually decreased over the 4 months. His sleep patterns were regular. His heart rate variability indicated someone in a state of general calm rather than constant crisis. By every measurable standard, Kael was less stressed living alone on a death world than he'd been working cargo survey on a space station. "This doesn't make sense," Killick said, reviewing the data for the 3rd time. "Isolation, constant danger, limited resources, these should produce psychological deterioration." "Perhaps the constant danger is the point," Morvant suggested. On the space station, his work had no stakes. Here, everything matters. Some humans apparently find that focusing. They watched Kael spend his afternoon repairing a tear in his water collection system, a task he approached with the same methodical attention he gave everything. There was no urgency in his movements, no visible anxiety. He was simply fixing a thing that was broken because leaving it broken would cause problems later. When the repair was complete, Kael prepared his evening meal, dried tubers rehydrated in filtered water, supplemented with preserved fish, and a plant that tasted vaguely like extremely bitter spinach. He ate while reviewing his notes, updating observations about animal behavior he'd witnessed that day. Then he performed routine equipment maintenance, checked his perimeter markers, and settled into his shelter as the jungle's nocturnal chorus began. It was boring. It was sustainable. It was, despite every logical reason it shouldn't be, working. The Verdis researchers filed their daily report, noting that the human subject continued to demonstrate unexpected adaptation to hostile environment conditions. They were beginning to suspect they were no longer watching survival at all. They were watching something their species didn't have a good term for: a human simply refusing to accept that any environment was permanently unlivable. The Confluence patrol ship Meridian's Edge picked up Kael's distress beacon on day 147 during a routine sector sweep. The captain, a pragmatic Verini named Thesara, ran the calculations on response time versus resource expenditure and concluded that retrieving one human was worth the detour. Humans had a reputation for being politically complicated when abandoned, and the Tethys Freight Collective would probably appreciate getting their surveyor back. The rescue team expected trauma. They'd reviewed the planetary classification, consulted with medical staff about treating exposure to hostile environments, and prepared for a survivor who'd spent 5 months in constant crisis. They landed their shuttle in the clearing where Kael's escape pod had originally crashed, activated their environmental shields, and proceeded with appropriate caution into a jungle that looked precisely as hostile as the database suggested. They found Kael harvesting something that resembled squash from a cultivated garden patch, in a clearing that appeared almost pleasant if one ignored the hostile jungle surrounding it. He noticed their approach, set down his harvesting container, and walked over to greet them with the calm demeanor of someone receiving expected guests. "Good timing," he said. "I was going to start afternoon maintenance soon, but I can push it back if you need a few minutes." The rescue team leader, a Kesh medical officer, performed an immediate health scan while trying to process the discrepancy between what she was seeing and what she'd expected to find. The scan results came back, and she read them twice to confirm. Kael was healthier than when he'd crashed: better muscle tone, lower stress hormones, improved cardiovascular markers, and sleep patterns indicating quality rest. "How did you survive?" she asked finally. Kael considered the question, glancing back at his camp, the organized systems, the cultivated plants, the infrastructure he'd built through patient observation and systematic implementation. "It wasn't that different from the station I worked on before," he said. "Just with better air quality and fewer safety meetings." The Verdis researchers monitoring from orbit closed their observation files. They would eventually publish their findings, which would join the growing body of literature on human behavior under extreme conditions. The central thesis would note that humans didn't survive hostile environments through superior strength or advanced technology. They survived through the apparently unshakable conviction that chaos was merely disorganized potential, and given sufficient time and observation, any system could be understood, optimized, and made functional. Somewhere in the Confluence database, Verdis 9's threat classification would remain unchanged. The jungle was still a Class-VII Death World, still catastrophically hostile to most carbon-based life. But in one small clearing, a human had figured out how to make tea using local plants and filtered water, had established a sustainable food supply, and had apparently domesticated several species of territorial amphibians for security purposes. The rescue team helped Kael pack his essential belongings, mostly his notes which he insisted on preserving, and escorted him back to the shuttle. As they lifted off, he watched his camp disappear beneath the canopy, already thinking about the adjustments someone could make to improve the water collection system's efficiency. The Verdis researchers powered down their monitoring station, quietly disturbed by the implications. Humans didn't conquer death worlds through force. They simply treated them as particularly challenging home improvement projects and refused to accept that uninhabitable was a permanent condition. Given enough time, patience, and the stubborn inability to leave any problem unsolved, they would apparently domesticate anything, even jungles specifically designed by evolution to kill them. The galaxy, the researchers noted in their final report, should probably pay attention to that.